All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. It's V, the Guerrilla Economist, coming to you live on another edition of Hanging with Harley. And we have none other than the man himself, Harley Schlangler. He needs no introduction. He is the voice of clarity and reason in a chaotic world. You can find his work at the schillerinstitute.org, theschillerinstitute.org, as well as larouchepack.com, larouchepack.com. And with that being said, Harley, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, doing much better than the world.
So, I mean, what do you think, Harley? Are we all going to glow in the dark pretty soon? I mean, we're
Well,
on the brink of war. There's so much stuff going on, so much rhetoric, so much saber rattling, the insanity of the Brits. I mean, where do we begin?
well, you just hit the key problem. The Brits are insane. Most of the media in the transatlantic world is dominated by the British Wall Street, New York Times, Washington Post networks. So people don't know what's going on. But actually, hopefully, in the short time we have today, I can go through some things that might give people some hope. Because let's take the most obvious one, the Mad Theresa May and her sidekick Bojo Johnson. They've put themselves out on a very breakable limb. They went with no evidence and charged the Russians with carrying out a poisoning. And now what we're seeing is that even their own intelligence experts can't confirm that this was a Russian agent, that the Russians did it. The story's falling apart. And the countries that went along with Britain the most, like Germany, that's not a big surprise. But the Russians have a counter strategy, and they're basically saying, show us the evidence, let's discuss the evidence. And in the meantime, despite the outward appearance that the US is going along with the British, if you read the British press, they're hysterical that Trump has refused to blame Putin, has refused to make a big deal out of it. Yeah, we kicked out 60 Russian, but then we said they could send 60 more in, 60 different ones in. So this is a bit of a nuanced situation. Take the trade war question. Are we really on the edge of a trade war with China? I think people don't understand that Trump has a certain view of how you negotiate, which he learned from dealing with mafia unions in New York City, which people who live there know something about. You start the negotiations with a sledgehammer to the head.
Yes,
so
that's correct.
So I think the Trump-Xi discussions are continuing. The Chinese need the United States, and the United States need China, both for economic development, but also for North Korea. So I think the idea that we're about to head into a full-fledged trade war is part of the hysteria being whipped up by the Wall Street guys, who actually are much more worried about something more dangerous than a trade war with China, which is a blowout of debt, government debt, bonded debt, junk debt, family debt. There's a much greater concern with that, really, than there is with a trade war with China. So what does the media do? The Chinese boogeyman is about to retaliate against the United States, and the madman Trump is about to launch a trade war. So if people can get out of the media and actually look from a higher standpoint at the strategic realities, it's not as bleak as it appears.
Yeah, no, definitely. Also, I found it of great amusement, Harley. We had the caravan of saints that was stopped abruptly in Mexico. Tens of thousands of saints that are funded by George Soros with links to the Clinton Foundation stopped at a sports stadium in Mexico. They're at a complete standstill because Trump said, we're going to pull your foreign aid if you don't get a handle on it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you have that. And the other thing, don't underestimate the importance of desperation around the Mueller investigation. Because his statement the other day, I wouldn't bet too much on this when he said that he doesn't have anything on Trump that ties him to a crime. Now he's going to keep looking. But that in itself is quite interesting. and then that the British had to come out in their own name, putting their own intelligence service on the line with this Skripal case. And what do we know about British intelligence? They're always manufacturing a false flag, whether it's Iraqi WMDs, Syrian chemical weapons. That's how they operate. And now it's out in the open. And a British prime minister put her whole reputation and the reputation of her government, which isn't a very good reputation to start with, on the line with this one. So we can see the structures of sin starting to collapse.
Yeah. Well, Harley, let me ask you this. This whole thing with Skripal, we all know that it's BS. We all know that, if the Russians wanted to have gotten Skripal, they could have gotten him when he was in prison for 8 months.
Yeah.
Do you think that this Skripal thing was actually designed as a power play to get rid of Theresa May? Because the woman literally put her entire reputation behind the Skripal thing. And same thing with that incompetent twit, Boris Johnson. Do you think that could be a possible angle?
Well, sometimes people read into things in a way that is not that useful. Here's the way I look at it. She's in a desperate situation. Brexit is the whole thing is being challenged and being threatened by the British establishment. The city of London is in terrible shape financially. They're sitting on top of trillions of dollars of uncollectible debt. And May was never particularly competent. I mean, she was in charge of security, internal security in Britain when jihadists were shuttling in and out of the country like prostitutes at Grand Central Station. So, she's not a competent person to start with. But I don't think she calls the shots on this. Now, if there were a stronger government in waiting that the upper elites in Britain had in mind, I'd give some credibility to this idea that she might have been set up. I think this is a desperate attempt to counter the motion around the New Silk Road, around the potential of a Trump alliance with Russia, China, and India, and the emergence of the petro yuan, the emergence of a new financial system in the horizon, that they're desperate, and war to them is an obvious option. So that's how I look at it. Now, are there some people who said this is an easy way to get rid of her? Maybe. But I think more compelling is the argument that we're looking at the last gasps of a dying empire. And if you read this week's London Economist, you see how hysterical they are about Trump, that Trump hasn't quit fighting. They thought Trump would surrender by now. Even with all the things Trump does that I don't agree with, Trump, on the question of Russia and China, is holding firm. On the question of moving against the free trade agreements, is holding firm. And I think there's a real potential within alternative deep state networks. It's coming from the fact that these guys are incompetent, their system has failed, and a growing number of people are onto them and aren't going to support them or allow them to continue their game.
Yeah, I definitely see that. Recently, over the last several weeks, we actually had the three stooges of apocalypse: Pompeo, Pompous Pompeo, Nikki the Waffle House waitress Haley, and the one and only maniacal mustache John Bolton. How do you think these characters are affecting foreign policy, or are they just figureheads being lined up to be fired?
Well, here's an interesting thing. The best thing I could say on that is that in terms of Haley and Pompeo, well, in terms of Haley, she's out on a limb attacking Russia every single day. What is Trump's policy? He says it over and over and over. He wants to work with Putin. He called Putin March 20th and said, Vlad, let's get together. He has refused to attack Putin, to the annoyance of the Washington Post and the New York Times. So, Haley's sort of a dog and pony show. Maybe she's being held out there so that some of the idiot Republicans who think we should be at war with Russia at least think they have someone in the Trump camp who's for war. In terms of Pompeo, his whole curriculum vitae looks pretty bad. but I don't know how much power he's going to have as Secretary of State. And as far as Bolton, there's an interesting thing about Bolton. I think Bolton is a nutcase who's a real problem, except for one thing. He's one of the few people who has continued to support the idea of Ronald Reagan's approach to the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this may be a surprise to you, V, but we found a speech from him in 1999, a speech from him again in 2009, where Bolton has said he supports sharing missile defense technology with Russia.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
And he said, because of the same reason Reagan was for it. We don't want to have nuclear war, and we're better off with sharing these new technologies than going into an arms race. Now,
right. On
the other side, you have Bolton saying bomb Iran, bomb North Korea.
That's the caveat.
Yeah.
So he just has to keep him on a short leash.
Well, the good thing
in that
is
regard,
president. That's the good thing. He's not the president. And the other good thing is that Trump doesn't have much of a record for listening to advisors.
Correct.
So, I mean, he seems to send people out to do a job and then fire them. So we'll see. But I think that as long as Trump is making the policy, Nikki Haley can move her yap as much as she wants. All it does is discredit her.
Yeah. Harley, what else is on your radar that you've been keying up on?
Well, to go back to the economic side of things for a moment, there's a growing discrepancy between the LIBOR rate and the Fed rate. Have you set that up? This is very dangerous. It's moving into the same realm that existed in 2007, 2008. Now, is the LIBOR still rigged? Probably. Is it still there for the banks to make profits from marketing debt? Of course it is. But when you start having divergences, it shows that the system cannot keep functioning. And with the debt that has to be rolled over, we're seeing the volatility in the stock market. Is this really because Trump tweeted something about Amazon? Is it really because people are so worried about a trade war? Or is it because people are hedging their bets every single day, thinking maybe the apocalypse is coming tomorrow, I'd better take my losses or protect myself from losses, take my profits today? So I think there's a very fluid situation economically, fluid in the sense that people are panicked and they're not sure what to do. And by people, I mean the largest banks, the trading companies. And you see interesting signs that they're looking for a way out. Morgan Stanley, for example, opening up a major operation with the Silk Road, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They're hedging their bets. Some of these German banks are moving together with China. The Austrian government, and Austria is a small country, but they just sent 170 CEOs with their president and their chancellor to China to talk about trade deals. And I was just in Vienna last week and met with people in business and industry and government, and they were all talking so differently from a year ago about how China's the future and how the neoliberal system doesn't work. The neoliberal system is essentially called the Austrian school. And here you have the Austrians saying, well, the Austrian school, to the extent that it's been taken over by central banks, doesn't work. So let's see what else is out there. So I think we're at a real point of potential change on the economy because they don't know what to do. The people who think they can control things, the titans of Wall Street and the City of London, don't know what to do. And there's a new system out there that seems to be working based on investment in physical production, in infrastructure, in upgrading labor skills, in productivity gains, which we haven't seen in the West in 40 years. So this is where I think the volatility is coming in the markets. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this kind of panicked response continue for the next couple months.
Yeah, absolutely. You made a great point with the with LIBOR, and what most people and I know Harley, you caught this, but the audience might not have realized this, but there's two indexes that a lot of people watch. One is the LIBOR, one is the OIS. Okay, that's the LIBOR being for those that don't know, is the London Interbank Overnight Rate, and the OIS being the Overnight Index Swap. Case in point, folks, the OIS is basically tracks spending or lending between a nation's central bank. For us in the U.S., it will be the Fed index rate. Okay, that would be what we would be following here, or the Fed funds rate. Excuse me, that we'll be following here in the U.S. But OIS basically tracks what central banks are lending money out for, and LIBOR what banks are lending each other for short-term unsecured loans. In a world of in a world of non-liquidity and insolvency rampant everywhere, you're having for the longest time a very low LIBOR rate, very low OIS spread. Now it's starting to spike, Harley. Just like you said, I mean, the difference between the OIS and LIBOR. It's up over almost 4%, I think, right now. Yeah. And we haven't seen this. The last time we saw this was right before the 2008 bubble pop. Yeah. And we're heading that same direction. So what you said is absolutely right. It's spot on, man. It's really, really screwed up situation right now.
Well, and the problem is they never came up with a solution to what to do with the fact that you have zombie banks and zombie corporations that require fresh liquidity. And here you have the Federal Reserve using their old models to say we have to raise interest rates because we're a little worried about inflation and full employment. And instead of tossing these out the window because every time they apply them, they don't work, they're sticking with them. So you're seeing these anomalies emerge, which you just identified with the LIBOR and the OIS rate. And what it means is that any slight shift toward insolvency or a declaration of bankruptcy or a significant drop in the stock market could pull the whole thing down. And so that's why there's so much volatility in the markets right now.
Absolutely. Harley, your closing comments, sir. Go for it.
Well, I think the most important thing is that people should do what you've been advocating for a long time. Turn off the television news. If you're going to use the Washington Post for anything, use it for toilet training your dog or your parakeet. I would refuse to use the New York Times for that because I have too much respect for pet birds. But don't believe anything you're hearing in the media, whether it's about Russiagate, whether it's about the Skripal case, China, the Middle East, Mohammed bin Salman. The world is in incredible motion and flux right now. And there's one group that knows what they're doing and is moving with a strategy. And that's the Russia, China, India. They don't know everything. They don't control everything. But they're operating with a sound strategy of basing credit on physical production and taking the fluff out of their economy. In the West, we're operating from a standpoint of failed banking axioms. These don't work. And as a result, the panic is, how do you stop Russia and China and other countries from succeeding? And even more importantly, how do you prevent countries like Italy, Austria, and even Germany from deciding to break with the West, ally themselves with the growing Silk Road policy? Even Saudi Arabia. Is it possible Saudi Arabia will end up breaking with the British and the United States? Keep an eye on this negotiations going on for the Russian weapons systems between the Russians and the Saudis. So we're on the verge of tectonic shifts strategically. And there are people in the United States and Britain who are crazy enough to say, if we can't control it, we're willing to go to war. But I think the real issue here is, don't sit down looking for coded messages on the internet. Get involved in organizing your Congress to support these initiatives, support the LaRouche IV laws, the Glass-Steagall policy, the credit system policy, the break with the funny money policy, put the Fed under supervision and eventually bankruptcy reorganization. These are things that can be done. Fight for them. Don't spend your time looking for modern day Nostradamus to make predictions that are in some cases self-evident.
Absolutely. Very well said. Folks, thank you all for listening in. This is Harley Schlanger, and you can follow him again, the schillerinstitute.org, schillerinstitute.org, as well as larouchepack.com. Harley, thank you so much for, again, calming our nerves and once again pushing us back from the brink of the precipice, mentally and emotionally speaking. Harley?
Yeah, see you next week.
You got it, buddy. Take care. See you next week. Take it away, CJ.